Once there was a writer known for producing deeply thoughtful work, someone who built a reputation through discipline and consistent creativity. Piece after piece, the ideas came, each one sharper than the last, each one resonating. From the outside, it looked effortless, like a mind that never ran dry. But at some point, that flow stopped, and the more pressure they put on themselves to create something meaningful again, the more distant it became. What once felt natural turned rigid. What once flowed freely became forced. And the shift didn't come from trying harder, it came from letting go. When the need to control the outcome faded, clarity returned on its own. This is where something quietly powerful reveals itself. The more attached you are to results, the more you interfere with the very actions that create them. But when your focus returns to what you can actually control, your effort becomes calmer, sharper, and far more effective. Sitting in front of a blank page can feel heavier than it should. At first, it seems simple. Focus, think harder, pull something meaningful out of your mind. So you lean in and try to force clarity into existence. But the more you push, the tighter everything becomes. Thoughts don't flow, they stall. Ideas don't form, they scatter. What should feel natural starts to feel mechanical, almost strained. And with that strain comes frustration. A quiet sense that something is off, even though you're doing exactly what you were taught to do. Try harder. So you keep going, you stare longer, you replay fragments of ideas, hoping one expands into something complete. You demand progress as if pressure alone can create it. But instead of movement, there's resistance. Instead of clarity, there's noise. And slowly, your attention shifts. Not to the process, but to the result. That's where things begin to break. Because now, every second without progress feels like failure. Every pause feels like proof that something isn't working. And then something changes. Not because you solved it, but because you stopped forcing it. You step away. You loosen your grip, and in that distance, something unexpected happens. The idea returns, quietly, without pressure, almost as if it had been waiting for you to get out of the way. That's when a different kind of understanding begins to form. The problem was never a lack of effort. It was the way that effort was being used. There's a difference between effort that supports action and effort that suffocates it. When you try to control every step, you narrow your awareness. You force something that doesn't respond well to force. Thought, creativity, insight. These things don't speed up because you demand more from them. They slow down, they retreat, they wait until the pressure disappears. This pattern doesn't stay confined to writing. It shows up everywhere. The more you try to force a specific outcome, the more unnatural your actions become. You hesitate where you shouldn't. You overcorrect. You start calculating instead of responding, and that calculation breaks your rhythm. Instead of moving forward, you pause, you question, you second-guess. What once felt automatic becomes effortful, and that effort creates friction, not in the world around you, but within you. This is where the Stoic perspective becomes clear. You can act, you can prepare, you can focus, but the outcome itself is not yours to control, and the moment you try to control it directly, you create tension, because now you're reaching beyond what actually belongs to you. That tension doesn't always feel like tension. Sometimes it feels like responsibility, like you're doing everything you can to make things work. But underneath it, there's pressure, a constant need for something to happen, and that need distorts your actions. The blank page becomes more than a page. A conversation becomes more than a conversation. Everything turns into a test, something to prove, something to secure. And once that happens, the process begins to collapse. Because you're no longer engaged with what you're doing. You're engaged with what you want it to lead to. And that shift, even if it's subtle, is enough to disrupt everything. There's a quiet principle behind all of this. The more you try to control what isn't yours, the less effective you become in what is. But when that attachment loosens, something else takes its place. a kind of steady focus. You're still acting, still moving, but there's less tension behind it. You're not constantly checking for results. You're not measuring every step. You're simply doing what's in front of you, and in that state, your actions become cleaner, more precise, more aligned. Not because you're forcing them, but because you've removed what was interfering. So when you look back, it becomes clearer. Nothing was missing, not ability, not discipline. What was missing was space. Space for the mind to move without pressure, space for action to unfold without constant interference. And once that space returns, everything begins to work differently. Not perfectly, not instantly, but steadily, naturally. The results you were chasing begin to appear, not because you forced them into place, but because you stopped getting in their way. If this way of thinking resonates with you, then subscribing isn't just about watching more content. It's about continuing to refine how you think, how you act, and how you respond under pressure. So if you're choosing that path, consider subscribing as a quiet step toward a clearer and more disciplined mind. And that space is easily overlooked because it doesn't feel like action. It feels like stepping back, like letting go, like doing less. But in reality, it's what allows everything else to function properly. Without it, effort becomes counterproductive. With it, even simple actions begin to carry more weight. This is the quiet paradox at the center of it all. The more tightly you grip the outcome, the more it slips away. But when you release that grip, even slightly, things begin to align. Not because you stopped trying, but because you started trying in a way that no longer works against you. There's something subtle that begins to unfold once you step back from that first moment of frustration. It doesn't stay confined to a blank page or a single task. It stretches outward into other areas, quietly repeating itself in ways that are easy to overlook. The same tension that blocks creativity begins to appear in conversations, in decisions, in performance. It's not always obvious, but the pattern is consistent. The harder you try to force a specific outcome, the more unnatural your actions become. And when actions lose their natural rhythm, the result you're chasing starts to drift further away. At first, it feels like the solution is simple. Just apply more effort, focus harder, care more. That's what most people are taught, and in many situations, that approach works. But there are certain processes that don't respond well to pressure. They require something different, something less aggressive and more aligned. When the mind becomes overly fixated on results, it begins to operate in a distorted way. Instead of responding to what's happening, it starts trying to control what hasn't happened yet. And that shift creates a kind of internal friction that quietly undermines everything. You can feel this most clearly in moments where performance matters. When attention shifts away from the task itself and toward the outcome, something changes. Movements that were once automatic become deliberate. Thoughts that were once fluid become fragmented. You begin to monitor yourself in real time, analyzing each step instead of simply taking it. And in doing so, you interrupt the very process that allows you to perform well. It's not that your ability disappears, it's that your connection to it weakens. This is where the breakdown begins. Not because of a lack of skill, but because of an excess of interference. The mind starts to calculate instead of act. It tries to predict instead of respond. And while that might seem like a smart approach, it often leads to hesitation. Every action becomes filtered through expectation. Every decision becomes weighed against a future result. And in that constant evaluation, the present moment gets lost. There's a line from Epictetus that captures this shift with surprising clarity. Make the best use of what is in your power and take the rest as it happens. The simplicity of that idea is easy to miss. When attention stays within what is actually controllable, action remains steady. But when it extends beyond that, trying to shape outcomes directly, tension builds. And that tension doesn't improve performance. It disrupts it. What's interesting is that this doesn't feel like interference when it's happening. It feels like responsibility. It feels like you're taking things seriously, like you're doing everything you can to make something work. But beneath that, there's a kind of strain that builds. A sense that you're trying to hold everything together at once, and the more you try to maintain that control, the more unstable it becomes. There's a natural rhythm to effective action. It doesn't mean things are easy, and it doesn't mean there's no effort involved. But the effort is directed, focused, and grounded in the present. When that rhythm is intact, actions follow one another without hesitation. There's no need to constantly check, adjust, and reassess every step. The process carries itself forward. But when the mind becomes attached to the outcome, that rhythm is interrupted. Instead of moving forward, you pause. You reconsider. You question whether what you're doing is enough, whether it will lead to the result you want. And that hesitation breaks the flow. It introduces gaps where there shouldn't be any. It replaces momentum with uncertainty. Over time, this creates a cycle. The more you interfere, the less effective your actions become. The less effective your actions become, the more you feel the need to interfere. And without realizing it, you end up working against yourself. Not because you lack discipline or effort, but because the effort is being applied in a way that disrupts the process. This is where awareness starts to matter, not in a dramatic way, but in a quiet shift of attention. Instead of trying to control everything, you begin to notice where your influence actually ends. You start to recognize that certain outcomes can't be forced, no matter how much you want them to be. And that realization changes how you approach things. It doesn't make you passive. It doesn't reduce your effort. If anything, it refines it. You begin to place your attention more carefully, focusing on what you can actually do rather than what you hope will happen. And in doing so, you remove the unnecessary pressure that was clouding your actions. The result of that shift is subtle but significant. Actions become cleaner. Decisions become quicker. There's less second-guessing, less hesitation. Not because you suddenly have more certainty, but because you're no longer trying to control what can't be controlled. You're working within the limits of your influence instead of pushing against them. And within those limits, something starts to open up. There's more room to respond to what's actually happening rather than what you fear or expect might happen. Your attention becomes more grounded, more present. And in that state, performance improves, not through force, but through alignment. This pattern keeps repeating itself, not as a problem, but as a signal. Every time you feel that tension, that urge to force an outcome, it's an indication that your focus has shifted beyond what you can control. And each time you bring it back even slightly, you restore that natural rhythm. So the issue was never about trying too little. It was about trying in a way that interferes, and once that becomes clear, the approach changes. Effort remains, but it becomes quieter, more precise, less reactive. And in that shift, the process begins to work the way it was meant to all along. There's a version of this pattern that becomes even more visible when other people are involved. It doesn't show up as a blank page or a stalled idea, but as a subtle tension in the way someone carries themselves. You can sense it in conversations, in tone, in the way words are chosen. Someone tries a little too hard to sound impressive, to appear confident, to make sure they are seen a certain way. And even if nothing is said directly, something feels off. Not dramatically, not in a way that's easy to point out, but enough to create distance. It's not that the effort is obvious. In fact, it's often disguised as enthusiasm or confidence, but underneath that, there's pressure, a need to be perceived in a certain light, a quiet urgency to be validated, and that urgency leaks into everything. The pacing of speech becomes slightly rushed. The focus shifts from connection to performance. Instead of simply being present, there's a constant awareness of how things are being received. And that's where the contradiction begins. Because the more someone tries to control how they are perceived, the less natural they appear. The more they try to establish their value, the more uncertain it can seem. Not because they lack value, but because the act of proving it creates tension. And tension, even when subtle, is something people pick up on quickly. It's a strange dynamic. On the surface, it looks like effort should help. If you want to be respected, you should show your strengths. If you want to be liked, you should present yourself well. And those things are true to a degree. But there's a point where that effort crosses into force, where expression turns into performance, and once that line is crossed, the effect begins to reverse. Instead of drawing people in, it creates hesitation. Instead of building trust, it raises quiet questions, not conscious ones, but impressions. A sense that something is being pushed rather than revealed. And most of the time this isn't intentional, it's driven by something deeper. A need to secure a certain outcome, to ensure that others see you in a specific way. That need changes everything. It shifts your attention away from the moment and onto the impression you're trying to create. You start adjusting yourself in real time, filtering your words, measuring your reactions. And while that might seem like control, it actually reduces your ability to respond naturally. You're no longer engaging fully with what's happening. You're managing it. This is where the disconnect forms, because real connection doesn't come from control. It comes from presence, from being fully engaged without constantly checking how you're being perceived. And the moment that presence is replaced by performance, something is lost. Not dramatically, but enough to be felt. There's a line from Seneca that quietly points to this. Care more for a good conscience than for what others say of you. It's not a rejection of others, but a shift in focus. When your attention is grounded internally, your actions become more stable. But when it's tied to external approval, it becomes reactive. You begin to adjust based on imagined responses rather than actual ones. And that reactivity creates instability, because you can't fully control how others see you. No matter how much you try to shape that perception, there are too many variables, different perspectives, different expectations, different interpretations, and trying to manage all of that at once is not just difficult, it's impossible. So what happens instead is a kind of overcompensation. You try a little harder, you emphasize a little more, you push just enough to make sure your message lands. But each of those adjustments adds more tension. And over time, that tension becomes the dominant signal, overshadowing whatever you were trying to convey in the first place. The shift away from this doesn't come from withdrawing or becoming indifferent. It comes from removing the need to prove something in every interaction, from allowing your actions to stand on their own without constant reinforcement. And when that need fades, something changes immediately. There's less pressure behind your words, less urgency in how you present yourself. You're no longer trying to control the outcome of every exchange. And because of that, your attention returns to the moment itself. You listen more clearly, you respond more directly. There's less filtering, less hesitation. And that creates a different kind of presence. One that doesn't need to announce itself. It's steady, grounded, and noticeably more authentic. Not because you're trying to appear that way, but because you're no longer trying to appear as anything at all. People tend to respond to that without needing to understand why. There's a sense of ease in it, a lack of pressure that makes interaction feel more natural. And ironically, the very things that were being forced before, respect, interest, connection, begin to emerge without being pushed. This doesn't mean that effort disappears, it just changes direction. Instead of being used to shape perception, it's used to stay present, to remain grounded in what you're actually doing rather than what you hope it will lead to. And in that shift, the entire dynamic transforms. What was once controlled becomes responsive. What was once forced becomes fluid. And the need to constantly manage how you are seen begins to dissolve. Not because it was suppressed, but because it's no longer necessary. So when nothing needs to be proven, there's nothing left to defend. no image to maintain, no impression to secure. And in that absence, something stronger takes its place. A quiet confidence that isn't dependent on how it's received. And that confidence doesn't come from trying harder. It comes from letting go of the need to try in that way at all. There's another layer to this that doesn't involve other people at all. It happens quietly, entirely within your own mind, and because of that, it's even harder to notice. You sit with a thought you don't want. Maybe it's worry, maybe it's doubt, maybe it's something uncomfortable that keeps returning, and your first instinct is to get rid of it. You try to push it away, distract yourself, replace it with something better, but instead of disappearing, it lingers. It repeats. It becomes sharper, more persistent, almost as if your resistance is feeding it. This is where effort begins to turn against itself. Not because effort is inherently wrong, but because it's being applied in a way that creates friction. You're trying to move in one direction while simultaneously holding on to the very thing you want to leave behind. And that creates tension. The mind becomes divided. One part is pushing, the other is holding, and in that conflict nothing resolves. There's a quiet observation from Carl Jung that captures this dynamic in a simple way. What you resist persists. It doesn't mean that thoughts are permanent or that you have no influence over them. It means that resistance itself becomes part of the process that sustains them. When you push against something internally, you create a kind of psychological pressure that keeps it in place. This is where a different kind of approach begins to make sense, not one based on control, but on allowing, not in the sense of giving up, but in the sense of removing the unnecessary resistance that keeps things stuck. When you stop trying to force a thought away, something changes. The tension around it begins to dissolve, and without that tension, the thought has less to hold on to. It doesn't disappear instantly. It doesn't vanish the moment you stop resisting, but it begins to lose its intensity. It becomes just another part of your awareness, rather than something that dominates it. And that shift, while subtle, is important, because it breaks the cycle of control and reaction. The Stoics approached this from a slightly different angle, but the underlying idea is similar. They focused on the distinction between what is within your control and what is not. Thoughts, in their initial form, often arise without permission. You don't choose the first appearance of an idea, but you do have influence over how you engage with it. And that's where the real leverage is, not in preventing thoughts from appearing, but in choosing not to attach to them unnecessarily. When you stop treating every thought as something that needs to be fixed or removed, you create space. And in that space, the mind begins to settle on its own. What's interesting is that this doesn't feel like control in the traditional sense. It feels like stepping back, like doing less. And that can be uncomfortable at first, because it goes against the instinct to fix things immediately. But over time, it becomes clear that this kind of restraint is more effective than force. The mind starts to move more freely. Thoughts come and go without being held in place. There's less urgency to react, less pressure to resolve everything instantly. And in that quieter state, clarity begins to return, not because you forced it, but because you stopped blocking it. So the issue was never the presence of the thought itself. It was the relationship to it, the tension created by trying to eliminate it immediately. And once that tension is reduced, the entire experience changes. Instead of being trapped in a cycle of resistance, you're able to observe without reacting, to notice without attaching. And that changes the direction of your attention. It moves away from control and toward awareness. And in that shift, the mind becomes less crowded. Not because thoughts are gone, but because they're no longer being held in place. They pass through more easily without leaving the same kind of impact. This is where effort becomes more precise. Instead of being used to fight against your own mind, it's used to remain steady within it, to maintain a certain level of clarity without trying to force it into existence. And once that becomes familiar, the pattern is easier to recognize. Each time you feel that urge to push something away, you see it for what it is. Not a solution, but a source of friction. And in choosing not to engage with it in the same way, you allow the process to unfold differently. So the mind doesn't need to be controlled as much as it needs to be understood. And once that understanding is in place, the need for force begins to fade. Creativity seems like something that should respond to effort. It feels reasonable to assume that the more you push, the more you should get in return. Sit down, focus, think harder, and something meaningful should emerge. That's how most forms of work operate, so it's easy to expect the same here. But creativity doesn't follow that pattern. The moment you try to force it into a specific shape, it begins to tighten. Ideas don't expand under pressure. They shrink. They hesitate. They lose the fluidity that allows them to grow into something complete. At first, it's subtle. You start with a direction in mind, something you want to create or express. That part is natural, but then the expectation builds. It has to be good. It has to work. It has to lead somewhere. And with that expectation, your attention shifts. You're no longer exploring, you're evaluating. Every thought is measured against an outcome. Every idea is judged before it has time to develop. And that judgment interrupts the process before it can move forward. So instead of allowing ideas to unfold, you start controlling them. You try to guide each step, to make sure everything fits together perfectly from the beginning. But that control comes at a cost. It removes the openness that creativity depends on. It replaces curiosity with pressure. And once that happens, the process becomes rigid. You're no longer discovering anything. You're trying to construct something that meets a predefined standard. That rigidity is what blocks progress, not because you lack ideas, but because you're not giving them the space to evolve. You're expecting clarity before the process has had time to produce it, and in doing so you cut off possibilities before they can form. Creativity needs movement. It needs room to shift, to change, to take unexpected directions. But when everything is tightly controlled, that movement disappears. There's a line from Plato that reflects this in a simple but precise way. Thinking is the talking of the soul with itself. When that conversation is forced, it becomes strained. It loses its rhythm. But when it's allowed to unfold naturally, it becomes fluid again. Ideas don't need to be pulled out. They need to be listened to. And that requires a certain level of patience. This doesn't mean effort disappears, it just changes its role. Instead of being used to force results, it's used to stay engaged with the process, to keep showing up without demanding immediate outcomes. That kind of effort is quieter. It doesn't push as aggressively, but it sustains the conditions that creativity depends on. The difficulty is that this approach feels counterintuitive. It feels like you're doing less, even though you're actually doing something more precise. You're removing the pressure that disrupts the process. You're allowing ideas to form at their own pace instead of trying to accelerate them. And while that might seem slower, it's often more effective. Over time, this changes how you approach creative work entirely. You stop trying to control every detail from the beginning. You allow things to be incomplete, to develop gradually. You give ideas room to grow instead of forcing them into a finished form too early. And in that openness, something shifts. The process becomes more responsive. Instead of feeling stuck, you start to move with it. One idea leads to another without being forced. There's less hesitation, less second-guessing. Not because everything is clear from the start, but because you're no longer trying to make it clear immediately. This is where creativity becomes sustainable, not something that depends on constant pressure, but something that emerges from a steady, open engagement. You're still involved, still active, but there's less tension behind what you're doing. And that makes a difference, because tension narrows your thinking. It limits what you can see. It pushes you toward familiar patterns instead of new ones. But when that tension is reduced, your perspective expands. You're able to consider possibilities that wouldn't have appeared before, and that's where original ideas begin to take shape. So the problem was never a lack of discipline or effort. It was the way that effort was being applied. Too much control, too much pressure, too much focus on the outcome. And all of that combined to restrict the very thing you were trying to produce. Once that becomes clear, the approach shifts naturally. You still care about the result, but you're no longer trying to force it into existence. You focus on the process instead, on showing up, engaging, and allowing things to develop without constant interference. And in that shift, creativity becomes less unpredictable, not because you've learned to control it, but because you've learned how not to disrupt it. You understand where your influence helps and where it begins to interfere, and that understanding changes everything. So when ideas don't come, the answer isn't always to push harder. Sometimes it's to step back just enough to remove the pressure that's blocking them, to create the space where your mind can move freely again. And once that space is there, the process begins to work the way it was meant to all along. At a certain point, all of these patterns begin to point in the same direction. The tension, the overthinking, the constant urge to control outcomes, it all comes back to where attention is being placed. Not how much effort you're using, but where that effort is directed. And this is where a more grounded perspective starts to make a difference, because without it, it's easy to fall into the habit of trying to manage everything at once, even the parts of life that were never yours to control in the first place. The Stoics approach this with a kind of clarity that cuts through the confusion. They didn't complicate it. They reduced it to a simple distinction. There are things that are within your control and things that are not. Your effort, your focus, your decisions, those belong to you. But outcomes, reactions from others, timing, external events, those do not. And when that line becomes blurred, tension begins to build almost immediately. The more your attention drifts into what you can't control, the less stable your actions become. Not because you lack ability, but because your focus is divided. Part of you is trying to act, while another part is trying to predict and manage the result of that action. And those two directions don't align. They pull against each other. One is grounded in the present, the other is fixed on an uncertain future. There's a line from Epictetus that captures this division with precision. Some things are up to us, and some things are not. It sounds almost too simple, but that simplicity is exactly what makes it effective. Because when you actually apply it, the difference is immediate. The moment you bring your attention back to what is yours, your effort, your choices, your response, the noise begins to settle. You stop trying to control how things will turn out. Not because you don't care, but because you recognize that caring doesn't give you control. It only adds pressure when it's directed at the wrong place. And that shift changes how you move. There's less urgency to force results, less need to overcorrect every step. Your actions become more precise. Not rushed, not hesitant, just clear. You do what needs to be done without layering it with unnecessary expectation. And because of that, there's less friction in the process. You're no longer working against yourself by trying to manage outcomes that aren't yours to manage. This doesn't remove uncertainty, that part remains. But it changes how you relate to it. Instead of trying to eliminate it, you work within it. You accept that results will come in their own time, shaped by factors beyond your control. And that acceptance removes a significant amount of tension from your actions. It also brings a different kind of consistency. When your focus is tied to outcomes, your motivation rises and falls depending on what happens. If things go well, you feel confident. If they don't, you hesitate. But when your focus is on what you can control, that stability increases. You act because it's within your control to act, not because you're guaranteed a specific result, and that creates a steadier form of progress, one that isn't constantly interrupted by doubt or overthinking. You move forward without needing constant reassurance that things will work out. And in doing so, you actually improve your chances of things working out because your actions are no longer distorted by unnecessary pressure. There's also a kind of freedom in this that's easy to miss. When you stop trying to control everything, you release yourself from a responsibility that was never yours to begin with. You're no longer carrying the weight of every possible outcome. You're focused on what you can actually influence. And that focus is lighter, more manageable, more effective. This is where clarity starts to replace confusion. Decisions become simpler because they're based on what you can do, not on what might happen. You're no longer trying to calculate every possible result before taking action. You're responding to the present moment with the information you have, and that's enough. Over time, this changes how you experience effort itself. It becomes less strained, less reactive. You're still engaged, still committed, but there's less tension behind it. You're not forcing things into place. You're allowing them to unfold while doing your part with precision. And that precision matters, because when your actions are aligned with what you can control, they become more effective. Not because you've guaranteed the outcome, but because you've removed the internal obstacles that were getting in the way. There's less hesitation, less second-guessing, more direct movement. This is the same pattern showing up again, just in a more grounded form. The less you try to control what isn't yours, the more effective you become in what is. The more you release your grip on outcomes, the more clearly you're able to act. So the shift isn't about doing less. It's about doing what actually belongs to you and letting the rest move on its own. And once that line becomes clear, the tension that once felt unavoidable begins to fade. What's left is something quieter, but far more stable, a way of moving through things without constantly trying to control them. And in that steadiness, your actions begin to carry the kind of clarity that doesn't need to be forced. Something shifts when you stop caring in this specific way, and it's not the kind of shift most people expect. It doesn't make you passive. It doesn't drain your motivation or make you indifferent to what happens. If anything, it sharpens you. But it sharpens you by removing what was never helping in the first place. The pressure, the constant checking, the quiet need for things to turn out a certain way, those begin to fall away. And once they do, your actions start to look different. You're still doing the same things on the surface. You're still working, still moving, still making decisions. But internally, there's less noise, less tension behind each step. You're no longer measuring every action against an imagined result. You're not pausing to evaluate whether what you're doing will be enough, whether it will lead somewhere, whether it will work out exactly as planned. You're simply acting within the moment you're in. That difference might seem small, but it changes everything. Because when you remove that constant layer of evaluation, your actions become more direct. There's less hesitation, less overcorrection. You don't interrupt yourself as often, and that allows a kind of momentum to build, not through force, but through continuity. One action leads naturally into the next without being weighed down by doubt. This is where the distinction between reacting and responding becomes clear. When you're attached to outcomes, you react. You adjust constantly based on what you think might happen or what just happened. Your actions become tied to results that are still unfolding, but when that attachment loosens, you respond instead. You act based on what is actually in front of you, not on projections or fears. And that response is cleaner, more stable. There's a line from Marcus Aurelius that captures this state with quiet precision. If you seek tranquility, do less. It doesn't mean doing nothing. It means removing the unnecessary, the extra layers of thought, the constant need to control, the tension that doesn't contribute to the action itself. And once those layers are stripped away, what remains is something far more effective. Your attention becomes grounded, not scattered across outcomes and possibilities, but focused on the task itself. You're not thinking 3 steps ahead while trying to act in the present. You're here, fully engaged with what you're doing, and because of that, your actions carry more weight. not because you're forcing them, but because they're no longer diluted by distraction. This also changes how you experience effort. It no longer feels like pushing against resistance. It feels more like moving with something. There's still energy involved, still commitment, but it's not strained, it's directed. You're not trying to bend the process to fit your expectations. You're working within it, allowing it to unfold while doing your part with clarity. And in that clarity, something important disappears. The friction that was slowing everything down, the internal conflict between what you're doing and what you wish would happen. That conflict used to sit behind every action, quietly interfering. But once the need to control outcomes is reduced, that interference fades. You begin to notice how much smoother things feel. Decisions come more quickly, not because you're rushing, but because you're no longer overanalyzing every possibility. You trust your ability to respond in the moment, rather than trying to predict everything in advance. And that trust creates a different kind of stability. It's not based on certainty, it's based on alignment. You're aligned with what you can actually do, rather than what you hope will happen. And that alignment removes a lot of unnecessary strain. You're no longer carrying the weight of outcomes that haven't even occurred yet. This doesn't mean everything suddenly works out perfectly. Results are still influenced by factors outside your control, but your relationship with those results changes. You're less affected by them, less thrown off when things don't go exactly as expected. And because of that, you're able to continue acting without disruption. That continuity is what makes the difference over time. Not a single perfect action, but a steady flow of clear, undistorted ones. Actions that aren't constantly being interrupted by doubt or pressure. And as those actions accumulate, they naturally lead to better outcomes. Not because you forced those outcomes into place, but because you removed what was getting in the way of reaching them. The process was always capable of producing results. It just needed to function without interference. There's also a quiet confidence that begins to form in this state, not the kind that needs to prove itself, but one that comes from experience. You see that when you act without unnecessary pressure, things tend to move more smoothly. You trust that process more, not because it guarantees anything, but because it works consistently, and that trust reinforces the shift. It makes it easier to let go of the need to control everything, to focus on what's in front of you and allow the rest to unfold. Not as a passive choice, but as a deliberate one. So what really changes isn't your level of effort, but the quality of it. You're no longer pushing against yourself. You're no longer dividing your attention between action and outcome. You're fully engaged in what you're doing, and that engagement carries you forward. And in that forward movement, something becomes clear. The results you were trying to force begin to appear, not all at once, not perfectly, but steadily. And they come not because you chased them harder, but because you stopped interfering with the actions that create them. What remains is a cleaner way of moving through things, one that doesn't rely on force, but on clarity. And that clarity, once it's established, tends to carry everything else with it. There's a quiet strength in letting go of what was never yours to control, not giving up, not stepping back from effort, but removing the tension that was holding you in place. When you stop forcing, you start seeing clearly. When you stop chasing, you start moving forward. And in that shift, things begin to fall into place in a way that effort alone could never create. If this way of thinking resonates with you, there's another video on the screen that goes even deeper into this path. Take a moment and continue the journey. And thank you for being a part of Stoic Journal.